The citadel Orani's floated in the cold dark of space like a city made of glass and light. It was the largest diplomatic station in the Orion Corridor, built at the meeting point of 6 major trade routes, and it served as neutral ground for every spacefaring species within 1,000 light years. Hundreds of alien races passed through its wide corridors every day. Some came to trade, some came to argue, and some came to remind the galaxy who was still in charge. The Valkyrie Dominion had been in charge for a very long time. They were an insectoid species, tall, armored, with dark chitinous plates covering their bodies and large compound eyes that never seemed to blink. They had ruled their section of the galaxy for 6,000 years, conquering or absorbing every species they encountered. Their fleets were vast, their soldiers were fearless, and their diplomats were known for one thing above all else: they never lost a negotiation, ever. So when the Valkyrie delegation walked into the main summit chamber of Citadel Orani's that morning, they expected the same thing they always got: obedience. 12 species had gathered around the curved table to discuss the new mineral rights treaty. The Valkyrie wanted access to 3 resource-rich worlds on the edge of a young species territory. The deal, as written, was not a deal at all. It was a demand wrapped in polite language. Everyone at the table knew this. And everyone at the table was expected to stay quiet about it. Everyone except the human. Commander Elias Cade sat in his chair at the far end of the table, looking completely out of place. He was not tall, he was not armored, he had no claws, no fangs, no bioluminescent markings, and no visible weapons. He wore a simple dark uniform with the emblem of the Terran Compact stitched over his heart. His hair was dark, cut short, and slightly messy. His face was calm. His posture was relaxed, and he was smiling. He had been smiling since the moment he walked in, and it was driving Overseer Viren absolutely mad. Viren was the head of the Valkyrie delegation, a massive figure even by his species standards, with polished black plates and a voice like grinding stone. He had led negotiations for over a century, and had never once encountered a species foolish enough to sit across from him and smile. Humans were new. They had been contacted only 11 years ago, and in galactic terms they were infants. Their technology was crude. Their ships were slow. Their bodies were soft. The Valkyrie had classified them as Class 11 primitives, 1 step above animals, 2 steps below relevance. The fact that they had been given a seat at this table at all was a courtesy, nothing more. Viren expected Cade to read the treaty, nod, and sign. That was what every other species did. Cade read the treaty. Then he put it down, folded his hands on the table, and said, very politely, "No." The room went quiet. Viren's mandibles clicked. "I do not think I understood you correctly, Commander." "You did," Cade said. "The answer is no. This treaty would allow your mining corporations to strip 3 of our colony worlds down to the mantle. In exchange, we get a trade license that expires in 6 years and a non-aggression pact that you can cancel at any time. That is not a partnership. That is a robbery with a signature line." Several delegates around the table shifted uncomfortably. The Trelawney ambassador stared at Cade as if he had just pulled a weapon. The Gorathi trade minister closed his data pad and leaned back, watching with wide eyes. Viren leaned forward. "You are new to this corridor, Commander. Perhaps you do not understand how things work here." "I understand perfectly," Cade said, still smiling. "You are offering us a bad deal because you believe we are too weak to refuse, but weakness and newness are not the same thing. We are new, yes. We are not weak." "Your fleet has 43 ships," Viren said slowly, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "We have 43,000. "And yet," Cade replied, "here we are at the same table." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Every delegate in the room turned to look at Viren. The Overseer's compound eyes gleamed. His claws tightened on the edge of the table, leaving thin scratch marks in the polished surface. Cade continued, his tone still calm and friendly. "The mineral deposits on our colony worlds are valuable, yes, but they are ours. We are happy to negotiate a fair arrangement, shared extraction, mutual profit, joint oversight. What we will not do is hand over our worlds because someone with a bigger fleet told us to." He paused, looked around the table, and added, "And I think several of the delegates here feel the same way about their own treaties. They are just too polite to say it." That was the moment the room cracked open. The Trelawney ambassador looked down at her own unsigned treaty. The Gorathi minister cleared his throat and nodded, just once, but it was enough. Two other delegates exchanged glances. Viren saw it all. He saw the foundation of 60 years of carefully built agreements begin to shift under his feet, and he saw exactly who had pushed it. This one small, soft, smiling human had just done something no species had managed in centuries. He had made the Velkari look like bullies in front of the entire corridor. The session ended without a single treaty signed. Viren left the chamber without speaking to anyone. His aides followed in nervous silence. The other delegates filed out slowly, whispering to each other, glancing at the human who remained in his chair, sipping something dark and steaming from a small cup. That night, in a private communication chamber deep inside the Velkari flagship, Overseer Viren composed a coded message. It was short. It was addressed to an office that did not officially exist, a branch of the Dominion known only to its highest leaders. They called it the Chamber of Final Ends. The message contained one word: deploy. 3 hours later, in a dark room on a station 6 systems away, a clawed hand opened a secure data file. Inside was a photograph of a human male with dark hair and a calm smile. Beside the photograph was a single line of text: eliminate with discretion. The operative studied the face for a long time. Her mandibles clicked once in what might have been amusement. "Soft species," she said to the empty room. "This will not take long." She closed the file and began to prepare. Her name was Keithra Jal, and she had been killing for longer than most species lived. She was Sirithi, a rare hybrid species, part reptilian, part insectoid, engineered through centuries of selective breeding by the Velkari Dominion for one single purpose: ending lives. Her body was a catalog of natural weapons. Retractable monofilament blades were fused into her forearms, thin enough to split atoms and sharp enough to cut through starship hull plating. Venomous spines lined her wrists, loaded with a neurotoxin that could shut down a nervous system in seconds. Her scales shifted color to match her surroundings, making her nearly invisible in any environment. And her reflexes were so fast that she could dodge a point-blank plasma round and strike back before the shooter's finger left the trigger. In 200 years of active service, Keithra had killed senators, generals, warlords, and kings. She had ended revolutions and started wars. She had assassinated a Gorathi fleet admiral inside his own command bridge, surrounded by 300 armed soldiers, and had walked out without a single alarm being triggered. The galaxy knew her by a title, not a name: the silence before death. She had never failed a mission, not once. When the assignment arrived from the Chamber of Final Ends, she opened the dossier and studied her target carefully. A human, species designation, Class 11 primitive, homeworld, Earth, a mid-gravity rocky planet in an unremarkable system, age of spacefaring civilization, less than 2 centuries. The target himself was a diplomatic officer, no military augmentation, no combat implants, no known weapons training beyond standard Terran service requirements. Keithra pulled up the biological profile of the human species and read through it slowly. No natural armor, no venom, no claws worth mentioning, blunt teeth designed for chewing plants and cooked meat, thin skin that could be punctured by a sharp rock, internal skeleton made of calcium brittle compared to the reinforced chitin of most galactic predator species, slow nerve conduction speed, limited sensory range, average lifespan, approximately 80 standard years, a blink of an eye in galactic terms. She almost closed the file right there. This was not a target, this was an errand. But she was professional, so she continued her preparation. She forged a set of diplomatic credentials identifying her as a trade consultant from the Marathi Collective, a small, neutral species that no one paid attention to. She modified her appearance with a light holographic overlay that softened her predatory features, and she booked passage on a transport heading for Citadel Orenes. She arrived 3 days before the next scheduled summit session. That gave her time to do what she did best: watch. She planted microsurveillance drones in the corridors near the humans' quarters, in the dining commons, in the gym, and in the observation lounge he seemed to visit every evening. The drones were the size of dust particles, invisible to any standard scanner, and they fed her a constant stream of data about Commander Elias Cade's daily life. His routine was simple. He woke early, often before the station's artificial sunrise, and spent the first hour of his day exercising. He ran on a track in the low-gravity gym, then moved to a set of metal weights. Keithra observed his lifting sessions with mild curiosity. The weights he used were not extraordinary by galactic standards, but they were heavier than she had expected for a species with no skeletal reinforcement. He moved them with slow, controlled precision, his muscles straining visibly beneath his thin skin. She could see his veins. She could see his tendons. Everything about his body was exposed, unprotected. It was almost indecent by Sirithi standards. After his workout, he drank that strange dark liquid. Coffee, the database called it, a mild stimulant extracted from roasted plant seeds. He consumed it constantly, carrying a cup with him to nearly every meeting, every meal, every quiet moment on the observation deck. She made a note: possible dependency, could be exploited. She watched him interact with other delegates throughout the day. He was patient. He listened more than he spoke. He laughed easily and often. He remembered the names of aides and translators and maintenance staff, beings that most diplomats treated as furniture. He asked the Trelawney ambassador about her family. He complimented the Gorathi minister on his new ceremonial sash. He was, by every measure, warm and approachable and entirely non-threatening. But Keithra was not most observers. She was a predator with 2 centuries of experience reading body language across dozens of species, and she noticed things that the diplomats and aides did not. His eyes never stopped moving. Even when he was smiling, even when he was deep in conversation, his gaze swept the room in small, constant movements, tracking exits, noting new arrivals, measuring distances. It was subtle. It was automatic. And it was the behavior of something that had spent its entire evolutionary history being hunted. His hand rested near his right hip whenever he stood still. There was nothing on his hip, no weapon, no tool. But the gesture was there, consistent and unconscious, like a reflex built into his bones. He positioned himself near walls and doorways. He never sat with his back to an open room. When a loud noise echoed through the dining commons one evening, a dropped tray, nothing more, his entire body tensed for exactly 1/4 of a second before relaxing. His heart rate, captured by her drones, spiked and then dropped back to normal within 3 beats. Keithra recognized these patterns. They were prey responses, the instincts of an animal that lived in a world full of things that wanted to eat it. She had seen similar behaviors in the nervous herbivore species of the outer colonies. It was confirmation of what she already believed. Humans were fundamentally prey animals who had somehow stumbled into space. Alert, yes. Watchful, certainly, but prey nonetheless. She selected her moment with care. Late in the station's night cycle, during the shift change when the corridors near the maintenance section were empty. Cade had a habit of walking back to his quarters through this section after his evening visit to the observation deck. The route was quiet, poorly lit, and had no security cameras for a stretch of 40 meters. It was perfect. She chose her weapon, the monofilament blade in her right forearm. One strike, clean, fast, and silent. The blade would pass through his neck before his primitive nervous system could even register the movement. He would be dead before his body hit the floor. She arrived 2 hours early and positioned herself in the ceiling crawl space above the corridor, her scales shifting to match the dark metal around her. She controlled her breathing, slowed her heartbeat, and waited. At exactly the predicted time, she heard his footsteps. Slow, steady, the soft sound of a creature that did not know it was walking toward its death. He passed beneath her. She could smell him, warm, organic, carrying traces of that bitter plant drink. His heart was beating at a resting pace. His shoulders were relaxed. He was unaware. She dropped from the ceiling without a sound. Her right arm extended, the monofilament blade deploying with a faint hiss. She aimed for the side of his neck, a guaranteed kill. Her muscles fired in a sequence perfected over 2 centuries of practice. The blade moved faster than any organic eye in the known galaxy could track. And then his hand came up. It should not have been possible. The monofilament blade was moving at a speed that exceeded the reaction time of every known organic species in the galactic registry. Kithra had tested it. She had measured it. Her strike could cross the distance from deployment to target in less than 90 milliseconds. No eye could see it. No nerve could respond to it. No muscle could move fast enough to stop it. But Elias Cade's left hand came up and caught the blade between his palms. The corridor fell into absolute silence. The only sound was the faint electric hum of the overhead lights and the slow drip of blood running between Cade's fingers where the monofilament edge had sliced into his skin. The blade had cut deep. 2 of his fingers were bleeding badly, and a thin red line ran across his right palm. But it had stopped. The blade that could cut through reinforced starship armor had stopped dead in the grip of a man with no claws, no armor, and no augmentation of any kind. Kithra stood frozen. For the first time in 200 years, her body did not know what to do next. Her training screamed at her to pull back, to reset, to find a new angle. But she could not move the blade. His hands were locked around it with a force that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than muscle, something ancient and stubborn and impossibly strong. Cade turned his head slowly and looked at her. His face was calm, not angry, not afraid, not even surprised. His eyes were dark and steady, and they locked onto hers with the kind of focus that made her feel, for the first time, like she was the one being studied, like she was the prey. "You're fast," he said quietly. His voice was conversational, as if they had bumped into each other in a hallway. "Fastest thing I have ever seen. But you moved your shoulder a fraction before you extended the blade. It gave me about 1/10 of a second." 1/10 of a second. He had caught a monofilament blade in 1/10 of a second using nothing but his bare hands and whatever primitive instinct told him to reach for it. Kithra's mind raced through the biological data she had memorized. Human reaction time was listed as slow, 200 to 250 milliseconds for a visual stimulus, far below Cirithi standards. But the files had mentioned something else, something she had dismissed as irrelevant. Reflexes. Humans had a secondary response system, ancient, deeply wired pathways that bypassed the brain entirely. When threatened, their spinal cord could fire motor commands before the conscious mind even registered the danger. It was a survival mechanism from a world where things with sharp teeth could come from any direction at any time. Cade had not seen the blade and decided to catch it. His body had detected the threat and reacted on its own, faster than thought, faster than fear. Kithra pulled harder. The blade did not move. She twisted her arm, trying to change the angle, trying to find leverage. His grip shifted with her, adapting, adjusting, holding. She realized with growing horror that human hands were not simple tools. They were gripping machines. 5 flexible digits with an opposable thumb, wrapped in dense muscle and tendon, designed by millions of years of evolution to grab things and never, ever let go. Humans had once survived by hanging from cliffs, climbing trees, and clinging to struggling prey. That history was written into every fiber of Cade's hands, and right now those hands were locked around her blade like a vice made of bone and will. She made a decision. If the blade would not work, the venom would. She triggered the spines on her left wrist. 3 sharp points shot forward and buried themselves in Cade's forearm, each one injecting a dose of neurotoxin designed to paralyze a fully grown Gorathi warrior in under 4 seconds. The spines sank deep into his skin, and she saw his jaw tighten. His pupils dilated. A tremor ran through his arm. But he did not let go. His face changed, not into fear, but into something harder, something that looked like resolve carved from stone. His breathing deepened. His muscles tightened. She could see the veins in his neck and forearms swelling as his body released something into his blood, a chemical response she had read about but never witnessed. Adrenaline. The human endocrine system had a panic button. When the body detected a life-threatening situation, the adrenal glands flooded the bloodstream with a cocktail of chemicals that shut down pain, increased strength, accelerated heart rate, and sharpened focus to a razor's edge. It was not controlled. It was not refined. It was a blunt, roaring, primal surge of survival energy that turned a soft, fragile human into something that could lift wreckage, fight through mortal injuries, and keep moving long after any rational calculation said the body should have collapsed. Cade's grip on the blade tightened. His bleeding hand did not tremble. His poisoned arm did not weaken. The toxin was in his system. She could see its effects in the sweat on his forehead, the flush spreading across his skin, the slight twitch in his left eye. His body was fighting it, not with technology, not with medicine, just with raw, furious biology, an immune system built by a world that had been trying to kill his species since the day it crawled out of the ocean. He twisted the blade sideways with a sharp, precise motion. The move was not elegant. It was brutal and mechanical, a technique designed not to impress but to work. The monofilament edge scraped against her forearm plates and the blade popped free from her grip. In the same motion, he stepped forward, drove his shoulder into her chest, and pinned her against the corridor wall. The blade was now in his hand, his bleeding, trembling, poisoned hand, and the edge was pressed against her throat, resting just above the soft joint between her neck plates. Kithra could not breathe, not because of the blade, it had not cut her, but because of what she saw in his eyes. There was no rage, no cruelty, no bloodlust. There was only control, absolute, terrifying, unbreakable control. He had every reason to kill her. He had every ability to kill her. And he was choosing in this exact moment not to. That was when she understood, with a cold clarity that cut deeper than any blade, that she had made a terrible mistake. Not a tactical mistake, not a planning mistake, a fundamental mistake in her understanding of what this creature was. "I am not going to kill you," he said. His voice was steady. His hand was steady. The blood running down his wrist and dripping onto the floor was the only sign that anything had happened at all. "I want you to go back to whoever sent you. Tell them what happened here. Tell them exactly what you saw. And tell them that the next time they send someone after me, I might not be in such a good mood." He held her gaze for 3 long seconds. Then he stepped back and lowered the blade. Kithra sagged against the wall. Her legs were shaking. Her hearts, both of them, were hammering so hard she could hear them in her skull. She had faced death many times. She had inflicted death thousands of times. But she had never, in 2 centuries, felt what she was feeling now. Fear, real, honest, bone-deep fear. Not of his strength, not of his speed, but of the calm, quiet certainty with which he had decided her fate and then changed his mind. He had held her life in his bleeding hand and given it back like it was nothing, like mercy was as natural to him as breathing. Cade bent down and picked up a small metal cup that had fallen from his jacket pocket during the struggle. He looked at it, shook it gently, and took a sip. The dark liquid inside was still warm. "Good coffee survives everything," he said, almost to himself. Then he turned and walked away down the corridor, his footsteps slow and even, his posture relaxed, his bleeding hand hanging loosely at his side. He did not look back. Kithra stood alone in the dim light, her greatest weapon taken from her, her venom useless, and her understanding of the universe cracked wide open. She stared at the small drops of red blood on the floor, alien blood, human blood, and a single thought repeated itself in her mind like a warning siren that would not stop. What are they? Keith Rajal arrived at the Valkyrie flagship 6 hours later, still carrying the smell of human blood on her hands. She had not washed it off. She wanted them to see it. She wanted them to understand that the blood was hers to show, not because she had spilled it in victory, but because it had been spilled on her, and she had survived only because her target had allowed it. The debriefing took place in a sealed chamber deep inside the vessel, with Overseer Viren and 4 members of the Dominion's Military Intelligence Division seated across from her. Keithra stood. She did not sit. She was not sure her legs would hold still if she did. She told them everything. She described the strike, its speed, its angle, its precision. She confirmed that it was the fastest and cleanest attack she had ever delivered in 200 years. Then she told them how a creature with no armor, no augmentation, and no prior warning had caught the blade with his bare hands and held it still. The intelligence officers exchanged glances. One of them, a senior analyst named Threll, leaned forward and asked her to repeat that last detail. She repeated it. Then she told them about the venom, 3 full doses of Sirithi neurotoxin buried directly into his forearm. She explained that the toxin had entered his bloodstream, that she had seen its effects begin, the sweat, the tremor, the flush of his skin. And then she told them that his body had simply overridden it, not neutralized it, not resisted it through some engineered countermeasure. His biology had dumped a chemical into his blood that screamed louder than the poison, and he had kept fighting, as if the venom were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. The room was very quiet. She told them about the disarm, about the pin, about the blade at her throat, and then she told them the part that she knew would disturb them more than anything else. "He let me go," she said. "He had the blade at my neck. He could have opened my throat with a flick of his wrist, and he chose not to. He told me to come back here and deliver a message." Viren's mandibles tightened. What message? That he was in a good mood. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Viren dismissed Keithra and immediately ordered a full biological threat reassessment of the human species. He pulled every analyst, every xenobiologist, and every military strategist available on the flagship and gave them one task: find out what humans actually were. Not the summary, not the Class 11 file. Everything. The report came back 14 hours later, and it landed on the conference table like a bomb. Humans came from a planet called Earth. It was not, as the original file suggested, an unremarkable mid-gravity world. It was a death trap. The planet's surface was 70% covered in a corrosive solvent that humans called water, a liquid so chemically aggressive that it could dissolve rock over time. The atmosphere contained a highly reactive gas called oxygen, which caused metal to rust and organic material to decay. The planet experienced constant tectonic instability, producing earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis. Its weather systems generated storms powerful enough to flatten cities. Its biosphere was a war zone of predators, parasites, venomous creatures, and diseases that had been locked in an evolutionary arms race for billions of years. And humans had not just survived on this world, they had conquered it. The analysts detailed the evolutionary history. Humans were descended from arboreal primates that had climbed down from the trees and walked upright across open grasslands filled with predators faster, stronger, and better armed than they were. They had no fangs, no claws worth mentioning, no armor, no venom. By every standard measure, they should have been easy prey. Instead, they became the most successful predator their planet had ever produced. They did it through endurance. Humans were persistence hunters. They could not outrun their prey in a sprint, but they could follow it at a steady pace for hours, sometimes days, tracking it over vast distances until the animal collapsed from heat exhaustion. While other predators relied on speed and ambush, humans relied on patience and an almost mechanical refusal to stop. Their bodies were built for it, efficient cooling through sweat glands, long legs designed for sustained movement, and a cardiovascular system that could maintain moderate exertion for extraordinary periods. The report went on. Humans could heal from injuries that would kill or permanently disable most galactic species. Broken bones would knit themselves back together. Torn muscle would regenerate. Their immune system was an aggressive, adaptable engine that learned from every infection and became stronger. They could lose significant amounts of blood and continue to function. They had been documented surviving falls, burns, stabbings, and ballistic impacts that should have been fatal, through nothing more than biological stubbornness and emergency medical care that was, by galactic standards, shockingly crude. But the section that made the military strategists go quiet was the one about their minds. Humans formed bonds, not just with their own kind but with anything. They kept predators as companions. They named their machines. They mourned enemies. They were capable of astonishing violence and equally astonishing compassion, sometimes within the same breath. Their social structures were built on loyalty, sacrifice, and a deeply ingrained sense of fairness that could, when violated, transform a calm and reasonable human into something utterly relentless. And they did not stop. That was the core of the report, repeated in different forms across every section. Whether it was running, fighting, building, exploring, or simply refusing to accept a situation they found unacceptable, humans did not stop. They had no biological quit mechanism. Where other species had instincts that told them when to retreat, when to submit, when the fight was lost, humans had a gap in their wiring, a missing circuit. They could be outmatched, outnumbered, and outgunned, and they would keep going. Not because they were stupid, because something in them simply refused to accept defeat as a permanent condition. The final line of the report was highlighted in red. It was a single recommendation from the senior analyst, and it was written in language that no Valkyrie military report had ever used before. Recommended classification upgrade: Humans Class 0, do not engage. Class 0, the same classification given to stellar phenomena, rogue black holes, and extinction-level asteroid swarms, not because humans were as powerful as those things, but because, like those things, they could not be negotiated with through force. Meanwhile, the footage leaked. Nobody was sure how. A maintenance drone in the corridor had captured 90 seconds of the encounter, enough to show the drop from the ceiling, the strike, and the catch. No audio, no context, just a dark corridor, a blur of motion, and a human hand stopping a killing blow in midair. Within hours, it was on every diplomatic data network in the Orion corridor. Within a day, it had reached species that had never heard of Earth. The reactions were immediate and dramatic. 3 non-aligned systems that had been hesitant about opening trade relations with the Terran Compact submitted formal partnership requests. The Trelawney government quietly doubled its diplomatic staff on Citadel Orrenes and requested a direct meeting with Commander Cade. A Valkyrie vassal state, a small amphibian species called the Drenith, opened secret back-channel communications with the Terran Compact for the first time, asking careful questions about what protection might look like. On the station, Cade went to the medical bay, had his hand cleaned and bandaged, filed a short incident report with the station's security office, and went to bed. The report, which was later obtained and widely circulated, was titled, "Minor Altercation Resolved Amicably." It became the most downloaded document in the Citadel's diplomatic archive. The next morning, Cade appeared at the breakfast commons with his bandaged hand resting on the table and a fresh cup of coffee in the other. The Gorathi minister, who had been too nervous to approach humans before, walked over and sat down across from him. "Commander," the minister said carefully, "I have seen the footage." Cade looked up. "Which part?" "The part where you caught a monofilament blade with your hands." Cade glanced down at his bandage. It was not my best moment. I spilled my coffee. The minister stared at him. Then slowly he began to laugh, a deep, rumbling sound that turned heads across the commons. Cade smiled and sipped his drink. Across the station, in the sealed chambers of the Valkyrie flagship, Overseer Viren sat alone with the threat assessment open in front of him. He read the final line again. Class 0. Do not engage. He had ruled through strength his entire career. He had built his reputation on the certainty that force was the ultimate language, and that the Valkyrie spoke it louder than anyone. Now he was staring at a species that caught blades with their bare hands and then apologized for spilling their drink. And he realized, with a cold knot forming deep in his chest, that strength was not going to be enough anymore. The final session of the Orion Corridor Trade Summit began at the 9th hour of the station's artificial morning, and every seat in the chamber was full. This was unusual. Summit sessions often saw empty chairs, delegates who sent aides in their place, species who had already signed their agreements and saw no reason to return. But today, every ambassador, every minister, every trade representative, and every junior attaché was present. They had arrived early, some of them taking their seats a full hour before the session was scheduled to begin. The observation gallery above the chamber, normally empty, was packed with station personnel, journalists, and diplomatic staff who had no official business being there, but who had found excuses anyway. Everyone wanted to see what would happen when the human walked in. Cade arrived 2 minutes before the session opened. He wore the same dark uniform he always wore, clean and pressed, with the Terran Compact emblem over his heart. His left hand was wrapped in a fresh white bandage. He carried a data pad in his right hand and a cup of coffee in the crook of his arm. He nodded politely to the delegates as he made his way to his seat, the same way he had every other morning. If he noticed that every eye in the room was on him, he gave no sign of it. The Valkyrie delegation entered last. Overseer Viren walked at the front, his massive frame filling the doorway. His compound eyes swept the room once, lingered on Cade for a fraction of a second, and then moved on. He took his seat. The chamber fell silent. The moderator, a thin, elderly Marathi diplomat who had overseen these summits for decades, opened the session with the standard procedural remarks. But before he could introduce the first agenda item, Viren stood. The room held its breath. Viren was not a being who stood to speak casually. In Valkyrie culture, standing in a formal setting was a declaration of authority, of challenge, or of concession. Every delegate in the room knew this. Every delegate watched, frozen, as the most powerful figure in the Orion Corridor pushed back his chair and rose to his full height. He looked directly at Cade. "Commander," Viren said. His voice was controlled, but there was something beneath it that had not been there before. Not weakness, something closer to recalculation. The Valkyrie Dominion has reviewed the terms of the proposed Mineral Rights Treaty. We have determined that the original terms did not adequately reflect the interests of all parties involved. He paused. The room was so quiet that Cade could hear the faint hum of the station's atmospheric processors through the walls. "We are prepared to offer revised terms," Viren continued. "Shared extraction rights with equal profit distribution, joint environmental oversight, a mutual defense clause covering all territories included in the agreement, and a duration of 50 standard years, renewable by mutual consent." It was, by any measure, a fair deal. More than fair. It was the kind of agreement the Valkyrie offered to species they considered equals, and they had not considered anyone their equal in a very long time. The Trelawney ambassador leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. The Gorathi minister's eyes went wide. Two delegates from smaller species exchanged looks of open disbelief. In 6,000 years of recorded galactic diplomacy, no one could remember a time when the Valkyrie Dominion had voluntarily retreated from a position of power and offered better terms to a weaker party. Cade read the revised treaty on his data pad. He took his time. The room waited. He scrolled through each clause, pausing occasionally, his expression neutral and focused. When he reached the end, he set the pad down and looked up at Viren. "These are good terms," he said simply. He stood and extended his left hand, the bandaged one. It was a human gesture, one that the Valkyrie had been briefed on but that Viren had never performed. A handshake. An open hand, offered willingly to be gripped by another. In human culture, it meant trust. It meant agreement. And it meant that neither party was holding a weapon. Viren stared at the hand. White bandage. Faint spots of red where the wounds beneath had not fully closed. This was the hand that had caught a blade designed to cut through warship hulls. This was the hand that had held that blade steady while venom burned through its owner's veins. And now it was being offered in peace, open and unguarded, as if none of that had happened. Viren reached out and took it. Cade's grip was firm but measured, strong enough to be felt, controlled enough to be respectful. He held the handshake for 3 seconds, nodded once, and released. The chamber erupted. Not in applause, most of the species present did not have that custom, but in a wave of clicking, humming, chirping, and low rumbling that served the same purpose. Delegates turned to each other, speaking rapidly. Data pads lit up with messages being sent to home governments. The Drenith attaché in the observation gallery pressed both hands against the glass and whispered something in her own language that roughly translated to, "They did it. The soft ones actually did it." The rest of the session passed in a kind of stunned productivity. 3 additional treaties were renegotiated on the spot, each one revised to include fairer terms. 2 long-stalled trade agreements were reopened and signed before lunch. The Valkyrie delegation, for the first time anyone could remember, listened more than they spoke. After the session ended and the delegates filed out, Cade lingered. He gathered his data pad, finished his coffee, and made his way through the thinning crowd toward the observation deck at the far end of the station. It was his favorite place on Citadel Orenes, a wide, curved window that looked out on open space, with the faint glow of a distant nebula painting the darkness in shades of purple and gold. He was standing there alone, watching the stars, when he heard footsteps behind him. They were light, precise, and deliberately audible, the walk of someone who wanted to be heard. He turned. Keith Rajal stood at the entrance to the observation deck. She was not wearing her combat gear. She was not shifting her scales to blend into the background. She was standing in plain sight, in simple clothing, with her arms at her sides and her blade sheaths visibly empty. It was, by Sirithi standards, the most vulnerable posture possible. Cade looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned against the railing and waited. She walked toward him slowly, stopping a few meters away, close enough to speak, far enough to show she was not a threat. "I need to ask you something," she said. Her voice was quieter than he remembered from the corridor, less sharp, almost uncertain. "Go ahead." She was silent for several seconds, her golden eyes fixed on the nebula beyond the glass. Then she said, "Why did you let me live?" It was the question that had been circling inside her skull for days. She had killed hundreds of beings. She had ended lives without hesitation, without doubt, without remorse. She understood killing. It was simple. It was efficient. It was the final answer to every problem. But mercy, true mercy, given in the moment of absolute power, that was something she had never encountered and could not explain. "You could have killed me," she continued. "You had the blade, you had the position, I was beaten. In 200 years no one has ever beaten me, and you just let me walk away. Why?" Cade was quiet for a while. He looked down at his bandaged hand, flexed his fingers slowly, and then looked back up at the stars. "Where I come from," he said, "we have a long history of violence. We have fought wars that killed millions of our own kind. We have built weapons that could burn our entire world to ash. We have done terrible, terrible things to each other, and we carry every one of those things with us." He paused. "But somewhere along the way we figured something out. The measure of strength is not what you can destroy. It is what you choose to protect. I caught your blade because I had to survive. I let you go because I wanted you to live. Those are not contradictions. That is what humans are. Kithra stared at him. She did not fully understand. 2 centuries of training and killing had built walls inside her mind that a single conversation could not tear down. But something in his words had found a crack, small, thin, barely there, and light was coming through it. I have resigned from the chamber of final ends, she said. The words came out stiff, as if she were speaking a language she had only just learned. I have requested permission to remain on this station as an independent liaison. I do not know what I want to do next, but I know that I do not want to go back to what I was. Cade studied her face. Then he smiled, not the diplomatic smile he wore in the summit chamber, but something smaller and more real. Have you ever had coffee? He asked. She blinked, no. It is terrible, he said. You will hate it, but it grows on you. He pushed himself off the railing and gestured toward the corridor. Come on, I will make a pot. They walked away from the observation window together. The assassin and the diplomat, the predator and the prey that refused to be prey. And behind them, the nebula burned on in silence, painting the dark in colors that neither of them had names for. In the days that followed, the footage from the corridor continued to spread. It reached the inner colonies, the frontier stations, the deep space listening posts, and eventually the halls of governments that had never seen a human face before. Species watched it in war rooms and classrooms and living spaces. They watched the blur of motion, the impossible catch, the stillness that followed. And they began to ask questions about Earth and its people, not with suspicion or contempt, but with something new. Something that felt, to those who recognized it, like the very beginning of respect. And on Citadel Orenes, Commander Elias Cade went back to work the next morning, his hands still bandaged, his coffee still hot, and his smile still firmly in place. Because that was what humans did. They got hurt, they bled, they kept going, and they never, ever stopped believing that tomorrow could be better than today. That was the message. Not the blade, not the blood, not the impossible reflexes or the poisoned arm or the body that refused to fall. Those were just details. The real message was simpler and far more dangerous than any weapon the galaxy had ever seen. Humans did not give up on anything, on anyone, ever. And the galaxy was only just beginning to understand what that meant.